By the time the bells stopped echoing, it was already over. For champions stood in the ring with Bruce Lee. They had reputations built over years, bodies trained for endurance, and crowds that expected resistance. What followed lasted 15 seconds. No one cheered. No one understood what they had just seen. The ring looked unchanged, but the hierarchy inside it had collapsed. Witnesses would later agree on only one thing. Whatever happened did not feel like a fight. It felt like a demonstration, brief, controlled, and final. The ring was unremarkable, for ropes marked its boundaries, a canvas stretched taut, and lights hung overhead, spilling white over the floor. There was no grandeur, no drama in its construction. It was a place meant for demonstration, for measurement, for public observation, but nothing about it suggested that history would be made there. The audience had gathered quietly. They spoke in low tones, their anticipation subtle, controlled, as though they were aware that the event's weight was not in noise but in presence. Cameras were positioned at angles that would capture every movement, yet no one knew what to expect. The rules had been agreed upon days in advance. No weapons, no interference, timed rounds. Neutral ground for a contest measured not by skill alone, but by mastery within a framework. Bruce Lee entered the room last. There was no announcement, no introduction, no fanfare. He stepped lightly onto the canvas, eyes surveying the ring with a measured calm. The four champions were already present, arranged with the certainty of habitual authority. They were accustomed to being the center of attention, their movements rehearsed, their confidence visible in posture and gaze. Lee did not alter the environment. He did not raise his voice, adjust his stance dramatically, or attempt to dominate the space with size or volume. Instead, he observed, registering details in silence, noting angles, distance, and the subtle rhythm of the opponent's breathing. The room, ordinary in its dimensions, became extraordinary in its potential because of his presence. Witnesses later recalled that the tension was not in anticipation of motion, but in the expectation of control. Every participant was aware that in this neutral space, authority was not assumed. It had to be proven. And yet, in the quiet, it became apparent that authority could be present without assertion, that mastery could manifest without noise. The rules framed the contest, but the room itself framed something more fragile and far-reaching. A demonstration that would unfold not through time, but through singular, deliberate action. The air was still. Even those who had faced multiple opponents before sensed that the outcome would not be measured in rounds or points, but in perception. And in that quiet observation, the stage was set. The four champions carried their reputations as one might carry a shield, visibly, intentionally, and with confidence honed over countless contests. Each had been measured before, tested by skill, endurance, and circumstance, and each had emerged with the validation of authority. Their presence in the ring was declarative. Their postures broadcast experience. The audience, too, recognized them, not just for names or titles, but for the sense of control they carried, the subtle cadence of movements that spoke of countless repetitions behind closed doors. Bruce Lee, in contrast, carried nothing but presence. There was no visible record, no medals displayed, no gestures meant to assert dominance. Yet from the moment he entered, witnesses noted a shift, a slight recalibration in the way the champions held themselves, a pause in their usual certainty. He did not confront them verbally. He did not attempt to provoke or unsettle. He merely existed within the same space, measured and exact, and that alone introduced a challenge more profound than any spoken threat. The tension between reputation and presence was quiet but palpable. The champions, accustomed to having the room's attention validate their authority, felt its weight refracted differently against him. His movements, minimal and controlled, carried the subtle suggestion that mastery need not be proven repeatedly. Authority could be intrinsic, immutable, and understood without spectacle. Observers later described the scene not in terms of action but in terms of the energy in the room. The four champions had trained bodies and conditioned reflexes. Lee had trained perception and intent. It was evident that, within this space, conventional measurements of power and skill, speed, strength, endurance were secondary to the less tangible measure of influence. The quiet observation lingered as the final prelude. There would be no loud declaration, no overt intimidation. The room itself seemed to contract, aligning expectation with inevitability. And within that silence, the stage for the demonstration, brief, deliberate, final, was established. The audience had settled into a tension that was almost imperceptible. No one moved abruptly. No voices rose above a whisper. Yet there was a collective awareness that the moment was not ordinary. They expected struggle, endurance, back-and-forth exchanges, visible resistance. That was the pattern of every contest they had ever witnessed. Effort measured, sweat exchanged, victory earned over time. The four champions carried that expectation themselves. They shifted subtly in the ring, adjusting distance, testing balance, scanning for signals, each confident in the methods that had made them dominant. Their training had been precise, their minds disciplined to anticipate every angle. And yet, there was a quiet unease, a sense that their anticipation might not align with what was about to unfold. Bruce Lee remained motionless longer than expected, not in hesitation, but in deliberate assessment. His eyes traced the spacing of the ring, the posture of each opponent, and the rhythm of their breath. The crowd sensed it immediately. This was not an idle pause. Something was being measured, calibrated, and the tension in the room thickened without a single outward gesture. Expectation began to bend. The audience's anticipation of motion, struggle, contest, resistance, clashed with the quiet control emanating from him. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniable. Witnesses would later note the psychological weight. The mere presence of someone operating on a different scale of mastery shifted perception. The champion's confidence, solid in training halls and prior arenas, was now subjected to observation under a different measure, presence over performance. By the time any outward action would occur, the room had already acknowledged an unspoken hierarchy. The weight of expectation, carefully constructed by previous contests, began to falter. Not through confrontation, not through words, not through exertion, but simply through the quiet, assured observation of one who had prepared in ways that transcended conventional measures. It was in this silent recalibration that the inevitability of what followed took root. The room, previously neutral, now held a single, subtle truth. Outcome was no longer uncertain, even before the first motion broke the stillness. Then it began. The action was almost imperceptible at first. No flourish, no wind-up, no dramatic gesture. Bruce Lee moved, but only as necessary, precise, minimal, deliberate. Observers who later tried to describe it struggled, not from imagination, but from the suddenness with which control was established. The four champions, bodies trained for confrontation and competition, reacted instinctively. And yet, their reactions met not resistance, but impossibility. 15 seconds. That was all it took. To the crowd, it might have appeared like a brief exchange, a glimpse of motion too fast to parse. To the champions, it was the collapse of expectation, the unmistakable confirmation that the rules they had relied on, their techniques, timing, and strength, no longer dictated outcome. Every movement they initiated, every adjustment, met a precise counter, subtle enough to seem almost natural, yet decisive enough to prevent escalation. Witnesses recalled that there was no striking display of power. There were no loud collisions or dramatic falls. Instead, there was inevitability. Each champion found themselves repositioned, unsettled, disoriented, not by force, but by method. Authority was exerted quietly, psychologically. In those 15 seconds, the hierarchy of the ring inverted silently. Time, in the mind of the audience, stretched and contracted. Every second contained observation and calculation, yet no action lingered. What remained was clarity. Mastery need not shout. It required no grand gestures, no prolonged contest. In those fleeting moments, the demonstration was complete. When the motion ceased, the ring seemed unchanged. But those present, witnesses, champions, spectators, understood instantly that something irreversible had occurred. The action was brief, but its impact was profound, and the weight of its precision lingered far longer than the seconds it had occupied. The ring fell into quiet, not the restless hush of expectation, but a deep, observing silence. The champions did not speak. They did not gesture, nor seek to reclaim their authority. Each adjusted stance subtly, checking balance, measuring themselves against a standard they had never confronted before. Witnesses later described the moment as unsettling. Not because of fear, but because understanding arrived gradually, unforced and undeniable. Bruce Lee stood still, barely breathing more heavily than before, his presence unchanged. There was no exultation, no display of triumph. Control had been established not through noise or aggression, but through the demonstration itself. It was not a matter of winning. It was a matter of revealing a hierarchy that the eye could perceive but the mind had difficulty articulating. The champions' faces betrayed no insult, only recalibration. They had been measured by skill and found themselves assessed by mastery. The audience, initially expecting spectacle, found themselves witnesses to something more subtle, the quiet collapse of certainty, the recognition that effort alone did not dictate outcome. Every body in the ring was realigned by observation, every posture subtly corrected by presence rather than touch. No one clapped, no one shouted. The room retained the same dimensions, yet its psychological contours had shifted entirely. The moment carried weight not in drama but in reflection. It was not about who moved fastest or hit hardest. It was about what could be accomplished through complete control, efficiency of motion, and mastery of perception. And then, slowly, life resumed. Champions gathered themselves, acknowledging the event without comment. The audience, too, began to murmur, but only quietly. What had happened could not be explained in simple terms. It had been witnessed, absorbed, and silently understood. Years passed. The ring no longer held the same audience, and the names of the four champions faded in public memory. Yet those who had witnessed that day carried it quietly, like a private ledger of understanding. They recounted it in measured tones, careful to separate fact from exaggeration, describing the event not as spectacle, but as revelation. Bruce Lee's demonstration remained singular. It was referenced in training halls and private gatherings, not as a story of conquest, but as a subtle benchmark, proof that mastery transcends strength, and presence outweighs repetition. Observers remembered the 15 seconds in fragments, the measured movement, the precise counters, the silence that followed. And with each retelling, the lesson deepened, not because it was explained, but because it had been witnessed. The champions themselves never sought to diminish or dispute it. Some adapted, some reconsidered their approaches, but none could replicate that exact alignment of perception and control. They spoke sparingly, allowing the story to take its quiet hold. In time, the narrative grew into legend, not for its drama, but for its inevitability. Even those who never entered the ring came to reference it, in hushed tones, as a standard for mastery. It became a benchmark, not in tournaments or matches, but in understanding the efficiency of motion, the depth of observation, and the psychological weight of quiet authority. Bruce Lee's presence, uncelebrated it at the time, evolved into a symbol of silent mastery. Brief, decisive, and enduring. By the end, the story required no embellishment. The audience who remembered it carried its weight. The champions who experienced it carried its lesson, and the memory itself endured as a quiet testament. Mastery, it became clear, was not proven through spectacle, but through precision, restraint, and the subtle recalibration of those who believed themselves untouchable. And in that silence, decades later, the legend continued, not because of what was done, but because of what was understood.